Howdy and welcome back to the workshop. In today's episode, we've got a little bit of a problem to solve, and that problem is that about 3.5 years ago, the godfather of all YouTube makers, Jimmy DiResta, printed up quite a few of these posters for me, and I've been owing him a knife ever since. So let's take care of that. What I've got planned is a very fun serpentine multi-bar Damascus pattern welded layered steel Santoku. Planning on doing an integral bolster and a white ivory paper micarta handle. So let's get to it. Well, my first step is going to be welding up my Damascus billet. I'm going to be using 1080 and 15N20 for the main portion of this. On the sides of my high carbon stack, I wanted to try welding some sheet metal on the sides to keep all oxygen out of the layers. This is the first billet of Damascus that I get to forge weld underneath the Baudry number 11, and boy oh boy is that exciting. I'll then forge in the corners of the bar, round it out, and then forge it back down flat. That'll give me the C shape that's the base for the W's patterning. Once I've got that bar cooled down, I grind it clean and chop it back up to give me 7 layers of W's. I just repeat the process again: heat, forge weld, cool down. And then one more time, chop it up into 4 pieces, stick it back together. Now I've got 28 layers of W's. This is a pretty fine, flamey, cool pattern. And it's gonna look really good when I forge it down into 1/2-inch bars, throw it in the twisting machine, and twist 3 bars right hand, 3 bars left hand. Twisting brings the pattern from the end of the bar to the surface when you grind into it in a cool and kind of directional way. Once those bars are twisted, I'll then throw it back underneath the power hammer, re-square it at 1/2 inch again, clean them off, and forge weld all 6 of those bars back together. This gives me a cool, flamey herringbone pattern, but we're not quite done yet. The plan is to throw a big old piece of Crew Forge V on the edge. This is a really good high carbon, high performance knife steel. The edge bar will give us a cool, bold black edge that should really help define the squiggles in our final billet. So once I get that Crew Forge V edge bar stuck on there, I'll cut out a couple grooves and waves, curves, I don't know what to call them, but they're coming out of the bar. That means that when I flatten that bar back down, rather than all of those bars and lines being straight, they'll have some nice groove to them. A little funk, little spunk, anyway. Once that bar is flattened down, my billet is done, ready to forge into a knife. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to have enough material. It's not quite thick enough for me to forge the integral bolsters that I'm wanting out of the steel. So I'll add those on later down the line. But for now, it's a lot of drawing and pushing and pulling and forging and whacking and manipulating the steel to get exactly how I want it. I'm going for about a 5 to 6 inch Santoku on this one. Nice tall blade, give us plenty of room for thin edge geometry in the final knife. So with the knife all forged out, I'm gonna clean it up a little bit and get it ready to forge weld on some bolsters. This is a technique that Salem Straub, my main bladesmithing mentor, taught me, wherein you take a cool piece of steel. In this case, I'm gonna be taking some of the untwisted ends from the W's bars that we twisted up earlier, flattening those down, cleaning them up, MIG welding all the way around, and then heating it back up in the forge and forge welding those back together. That'll give me a nice thick protuberance in between the bolster and the blade that should clean up for a really nice, good looking integral bolster. With the bolsters forge welded on there, it's time to heat treat the blade. I do this now because I don't want to waste that decarb material. Every time you heat it up past its critical temperature, about 1475, maybe 1500 degrees, it's actually bleeding carbon into the air. And so I want to save that as much as possible, and I don't want to grind in and get rid of that decarb material and then heat it back up and get more decarb. I want to do that all at the same time. With the blade heat treated, it's time to get all of the MIG weld out of the whole knife because, well, MIG weld isn't exactly knife material. We want good pattern welded material all the way throughout it. With the MIG weld cleaned off of it, it's time to start profiling our bolsters, profiling the blade, grinding the blade. This blade is going to get an S grind in it. The spine is at about 70 thousandths of an inch and the edge is at about 20 thousandths. That means that we've got a really thin knife, but it's nice and tall and it's still fairly thick. I only took that grind about halfway up the blade, so we've got a stiffer blade, a little bit thicker edge geometry, but we're going to change that right now by doing an S grind. I'm going to be using a 36-inch radius to carve a hollow out in the middle of the blade, and this really helps reduce the friction while you're cutting with the knife. After the S grind is established and I finish ground the edge, it's time to clean up the bolster and choil area with some high grit J-Flex belts so the whole knife is ready to hand sand. Well, I know it didn't seem like it, but that was 2 whole hours of just doing my S grinding and my finish grinding, but holy moly, me oh my, this thing's looking good. We've got a nice thin, like 1 to 2 thousandth thick edge. We've got a nice S grind in there. It's time to move on to the hand sanding. I'm gonna throw out my Trojan horse knife vise. First, I'm gonna sand out the fuller, and then I'm gonna go to the flats, and then kind of back and forth and just do it. Okay, so I've got the thing hand sanded, and I just wanna do a quick geometry test and see how things like cutting performance and food stick are. Now food stick is a little bit less important than the actual how it feels while you're making the cut, and this thing has very little friction as you are cutting, which is quite nice. Good catch. With the blade ground, I'm gonna move on to cleaning up the bolsters, rounding everything off a little bit so it's nice and comfortable to hold while you're using it. Because believe it or not, you know, knives should be comfortable to hold. Now that the majority of the blade work is done, it's handle time. I've got a nice block of white paper micarta. It's a faux ivory material. And once I get the tang fitting and the block is roughed down to my handle shape, I like to carve a small recess in the top of the handle for the bolster to sit into. And this technique is especially nice for doing V-shaped or curved fit-ups. With the handle roughly shaped at 400 grit off the belt, I'm gonna try to do a little bit of carving here. I wanna add some fun, neat little details into the top of the handle here. Give it a little bit of texture, give it a little something interesting to look at, some lines for the light to play off of. And all of this is gonna be done with a triangle file and sandpaper, but I don't think I biffed it too hard on this guy, and it's looking pretty nice. With the carving in there at 1,000 grit, I'm gonna move on to finishing out the rest of the handle to 2,000 grit, because anything less than that and it just picks up dirt. Now that the handle is pretty much done, I get to move back onto the blade, hand sanding at 600 grit. Now I'm gonna get all of these lines to go in the same direction, and once that's done, a little bit of Scotch-Brite will really smooth things out, get all of the J-hooks out, and get it ready to etch in the ferric chloride. I like to use a really weak dilution of ferric chloride. The stronger the ferric, the more it tends to muddy up and etch into your nickel steel, which in this case is 15N20. And so I like to leave that alone as much as possible. So the weaker that the ferric is, the deeper it'll etch into your high carbon, non-nickel steels, the more it leaves the other stuff alone, which I like. After my deep etch, I like to etch in my maker's mark before moving on to coffee. Now I'm using Cafe Bustelo. It's not actually Italian, it sounds Italian. I'm mixing this stuff up cold. I used to do it hot. I don't do it hot anymore because it doesn't make any difference. It still builds up a nice dark black oxide, which is what we want the instant coffee to do. With the blade looking fantastically contrasty, is that a word? I don't know. It's time to move on to the final glue up. A little bit around where it's contacting. There we go. It's the next morning now. We let this sucker dry overnight. Time to finish up the butt of the handle, and we'll sharpen it and we'll be done. I start my sharpening to establish the edge with a 1,000 grit Japanese water stone, then move on to a 3,000 grit stone before cutting off the wire burr that comes from sharpening with a leather strop. Well, I am absolutely thrilled with how this thing came out. I went a little bit overboard with it, but it's been a long time that I've owed him a knife, so better go a little bit fancy to make up for lost time. Now, several announcements. First off, Forge or Die merch, which is the first design that I ever combobulated, that's not the right word for it, that I ever did. Merch is up on the website, so go check that out. And for a very limited time, I'm gonna put 50 of each of these, both the white color and then also the beige, up on my website to ship out to you lovely folks if you want one. These were all hand printed by Jimmy DiResta on a turn of the century printing press. Super, super, super cool. I'll have the rest of them that I have available for sale at my booth at Blade Show this coming June in Atlanta. With that, thank you guys so much for following along. I had a blast getting to make this knife. I hope y'all are ready for more knife making videos because I've got to make my whole Journeyman test set before Atlanta Blade Show, and I want to mix in some other fun Damascus-y projects before then. Thank you guys for following along. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I always forget to ask you to not forget to like and subscribe. So please do that. Comment if you want as well. That also helps everybody out. Well, it helps me out, and it helps Isaiah out, and in turn, it helps out Marty. And how can, well, he destroys toys so quickly that really that's where the majority of the channel funds go. I bought this for him. He has had this toy for, what, 20 minutes, Isaiah?
No, he destroyed it.
It's gone. Squeaker's out. Alrighty. Well, see y'all later.